So let's start here with one of the really interesting questions. So one of the things that I love about what I do is learning how the mechanics of things work. And the American system of government has a lot of mechanics in it, a lot of little moving pieces. And one of the interesting moving pieces is the Senate parliamentarian. And people, a number of you asked questions today about who and what the Senate parliamentarian is. And somebody said, what is the historical significance of the parliamentarian, and are they really nonpartisan? Because Republican friends are saying that Democrats are cheating to get bills passed. Okay, so let's talk about what the Senate, not the cement, but the Senate parliamentarian is. And it's worth remembering, like, think about it. If you were going to pass a law right now on, I don't know, how many migratory birds a hunter can shoot in the first week of November, how would you do it? It's actually not a very easy question. I mean, like literally, how do you write the bill? What committee should it go to? What you're hoping to get out of it? Who's involved in the process? All those things. So one of the people involved in helping to write bills is the parliamentarian. And what the parliamentarian does literally is the person has a staff of historians and lawyers and people to say, yeah, this is okay for you to do, and this is not. And this is how you're supposed to write this kind of a bill, and this is not. And they actually take a look at the body of bills and at the things that people want to accomplish through bills and tell you whether or not the ways in which those bills are written is legal. And so the Senate parliamentarian is, in fact, nonpartisan. And my comparison between the parliamentarian and a partisan position is rather like your accountant, if you have one. Like, you go to your accountant to tell you how to do your taxes. And you don't have to agree with that accountant, but that person doesn't have a personal stake in how your taxes are done. But that person is there to give you advice about doing your taxes. And that's what the Senate parliamentarian does. So the current Senate parliamentarian is a person named Elizabeth McDougall. She has been in the position since 2012. The position has only been around since 1935, and that's really interesting. So why 1935? Because in 1935, there were people giving advice before that, but in 1935, there are, of course, all kinds of new questions about what Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal is going to look like, and what's legal for it to do, and how to go ahead and write the bills, and then the laws that the Democrats want to pass. And this is a very much a new era in American history. So we get the Senate parliamentarian to make sure the laws actually are legal and do what they're supposed to do. Because you can't sort of parachute in and say, well, I'm going to go ahead and do X. You actually have to look at the history of how laws are passed. The roots of the Senate parliamentarian come from the Constitution, from Article 1, Section 5. If anybody cares, I looked this up. I don't go to sleep knowing these things. In which there is the rule that says that each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. So this is what they do, is they hire somebody to help to do that. All right, so there's a Senate parliamentarian, there's also a House parliamentarian, and they both do this. It is certainly possible for the members of the majority party to overrule the parliamentarian and say, no, you're absolutely wrong. But you have to have a pretty strong case to do that, the same way that you need to have a strong case to say to your accountant, no, you're totally wrong about those laws. And that's not the way I'm going to do my taxes. You can always replace the parliamentarian with somebody else. But when people are like, oh, why doesn't Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, why doesn't he get this thing passed by getting a different parliamentarian? Why don't you get a different deal on your taxes by getting a different accountant? You could, but it's entirely likely that another accountant is still going to say you can't deduct, all the chocolate you eat at your desk, Heather. That doesn't count as any kind of a legitimate business expense. I'm mostly making that up. So that's what the parliamentarian does, and they are nonpartisan. And with luck, they're good at their job. And obviously, if this person has been around since 2012 through at this point into the third administration, right? She knows what she's doing, and is just a good advisor. So that's who the parliamentarian is. And the parliamentarian, as I say, has been there since 2012. So she went the entire way through the Trump administration as well. So the idea that she is somehow suddenly now fighting for the Democrats just doesn't hold water at all. And so now the question is something that happened, I think it was last night. I confess I kind of lose track of days and nights because in my line of work, we jump around so much. Like this happened yesterday, this happened 200 years ago yesterday, this happened whatever. I think it was yesterday. The real question on the table, of course, is this infrastructure bill. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about the infrastructure bill today. But in this discussion of the infrastructure bill, what the parliamentarians said was, it was actually very interesting because essentially, I think, and I have not read this decision or the bill myself. I know it's in the bill, but I haven't read the whole thing. And by the way, somebody wrote to me and said, why don't you read recently somebody said, why didn't you read the Georgia bill instead of just echoing people because it's really not bad for voting. And just so you know, I do read the bills, and I especially voting bills because that's my wheelhouse. But I don't always quote from them. I do quote often. You may remember I quoted a lot from the Senate report, intelligence report about the Russia investigation, and it's hard going for a lot of people if you're not used to it. So I tend to use other people's synopses because they're better at synopsizing things like that than I am. So anyway, I have not yet read the infrastructure bill, but I have read the Georgia voter suppression bill, which is quite an eye-popping thing. By the way, it's linked from the New York Times if anybody wants to see it. And it's not a terribly hard read in the most of it. If you're interested in that, you should read the first couple of pages of it where they summarize the bill and some of the changes that they make in that. You can literally see the words crossed out, and you'll get the gist of it really quickly. Anyway, so I haven't read the other one, but from what I have read about what the parliamentarian has said, essentially, it looks as if she has said it is okay for the Senate to reopen, or to open, not reopen, to open up a budget bill that passed in February and alter that bill with the material from the new infrastructure bill. Okay, I know that was really confusing. I'm going to back up and tell you what that means. So, first of all, the question is, what is budget reconciliation? And this kind of, honestly, I get very frustrated with the Senate laws, the Senate rules, because they're deliberately arcane, I think, in a lot of ways. The Senate stands very, sort of proudly on its traditions, but its traditions aren't that great. I mean, sometimes some of them are, but sometimes people have traditions because they're just too lazy to change them. Believe me, I'm from a family that has, we did clean the barn last year, but for the first time in 200 years, we didn't need those chairs that were full of squirrels. We really didn't. Even if I was one of the people advocating for keeping them. But just because something's been around forever doesn't mean it's worth keeping. And the House rules just seem to me to make so much more sense because they get updated all the time. The Senate rules don't seem to get updated that much. But in any case, as you know, the filibuster has been around since the early 19th century. And all the filibuster means is that there is no Senate rule to make people shut up. Quite literally, that's all that the filibuster is about. So what happens is when the founders go ahead and frame the Constitution, the country's teeny, the country's small, and they expect that both the House and the Senate are going to have systems whereby they will talk about doing something, and then they'll get talked out, and then they'll have a vote, and then they'll either do it or not. Simple majority, right? But what happens is the House grows really quickly, and so the House recognizes pretty early on it's got to have some system by which it can make people stop talking, because otherwise you're never going to get to a vote. So they do. The House adopts rules that mean that there's a certain period of time in which you debate something, and then you shut up, and that's a very unparliamentary way to put it, but eventually all the colleagues will cease to talk. And then they'll vote, and they'll either vote in favor of something by a majority or against something by a majority. End of story. We go on our merry way. The Senate stayed small, so it never had to do that. And so essentially all a filibuster is saying, I'm not going to stop talking. we can't come to a vote because I'm not going to stop talking, blah, 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 blah. And we have this idea that it's something noble, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Overwhelmingly, it is done by a majority to stop something that is very popular. So, for example, civil rights legislation is the thing that most people think about when they think about the filibuster. People like Strom Thurmond from South Carolina refused to stop talking so that the majority could put through civil rights legislation. So, okay, so the Senate, you can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, but by the end of the 20th century, there's a real problem because the Senate's got so much business, it needs to move stuff along. And it needs people to stop talking. So it develops a couple of things. It does develop a procedure to shut people up. It's called cloture. But in order to get cloture, you have to have 60 votes. And that's why people say to stop a filibuster, you have to have 60 votes. That's all you're doing is you're voting for cloture. So that the debate has to stop, but it doesn't stop immediately. It stops after, I think it's 30 hours. They also recognize that they have a real problem because there's a lot of business that isn't getting done under threat of people standing and talking. And so they come up with a couple of things. One of them is the idea that rather than actually standing and talking to filibuster something, that you can filibuster something by saying you're going to filibuster it. So instead of having to stand there and talk for 40 hours or whatever, you can just say to the Senate Majority Leader, not guy in charge of the Senate, which is the same thing, but it's not its official name, the Senate Majority Leader, you can just say, I'm going to filibuster that. Well, there's no effort involved in that at all. And that right there is how, under Mitch McConnell, the Senate just hasn't done anything because people will just say, oh, I'm going to filibuster that. And so they never actually had to stand up and do anything. And one of the things that people are talking about now in reforming the filibuster is saying we're going to go back to the talking filibuster, which is what it used to be, so that you can't simply say, oh, I'm going to go ahead and do it. You actually have to put some skin in the game and go do it. And at the very least, I like that idea. But budget reconciliation is something different. They also recognize that there were certain things that had to pass. Like you could talk all you wanted about, in this case, the Civil Rights Bill, and the country would still go on, but the country needed to be able to fund its bills. So what the Senate did is under the, or what Congress did is under the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, it went ahead and it exempted certain financial bills from filibustering. So under this system, there were three kinds of bills, all having to do with money, that that could be passed without running the risk of filibustering. Now, since then, to that list of those three financial bills, we have also added judicial appointments, which Harry Reid, a Democrat, did when he was the Senate Majority Leader because the Republicans were refusing to let any of Barack Obama's judicial appointments through. So he got rid of the filibuster through, it's what they call the nuclear option, and it's very complicated, but it's kind of, I won't explain it a great deal. What you do is you kind of do this quick little two-step to create a new Senate precedent. And it can be done, but it's kind of it's a two-step. I mean, it's a little bit, it can be done, but people don't want to do it because it is, you could blow up all of the filibusters tomorrow at the next time the Senate's in session if you wanted to using that. But it's kind of like, whoa, what just happened here? And then after Reid did it for the judicial appointments in general, but preserved it for Supreme Court nominations, Mitch McConnell, when he was Senate Majority Leader, got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations as well. So right now you can get through the Senate Supreme Court nominations, judicial nominations, and these three budget bills without the filibuster. So you just need a simple majority vote for those things, which is one of the interesting things when people talk about preserving the filibuster. They're like, oh, all these terrible things are going to happen. But all of the important things to the Republican Party, you could already get through with a simple majority, the budgets and the judges. But anything that actually is popular in the country, like, for example, gun control legislation, which I'll talk about in a minute, which as much as 90% of Americans want background checks, that requires 60 votes. So even after Sandy Hook, when the Senate had 55 votes, that's a pretty strong majority in a group of 100. to get background checks in place, they couldn't do it because something like gun control comes under the filibuster. Well, the budgets and the judges don't. In any case, so what the Senate parliamentarian did, whenever it was, within the last day or so, was to say, yeah, you can go ahead and you can tuck that infrastructure plan back in under one of those budget reconciliation bills, the one that passed before. Essentially, you can reopen that. And the reason for that is that the way previously that the Budget Reconciliation Act has been understood is that there was a majority of 3 and possibly 4, depending on whether or not there had been a budget passed the previous year, bills passed in a year under budget reconciliation. And by saying you can open one up, that's actually a really big deal, because it says, well, as long as you can open bills back up, well, heck, you can pass a whole bunch of stuff. And so I was actually a little surprised to see that, to be honest. So anyway, that's what's going on with that. It is, the Senate parliamentarian is not partisan. The Democrats are not cheating. If you remember, they got really angry over the fact the Senate parliamentarian said no to them on something earlier. The fact that the parliamentarian has said that they can reopen this bill in order to put through the infrastructure bill, that's a really big deal. And I think that's all everybody asked about the Senate parliamentarian and about the filibuster, I think. I hope that was enough on it in any case. All right, so the next question is this. And I'm sorry, I actually haven't been able to watch a lot of what's going here on the side. I'm sorry about that. But somebody asked, is Biden serious about bipartisanship, and will he negotiate what is included in infrastructure? And this is a really, really interesting question, because there's something fascinating going on in politics right now. So for what it's worth, if you read me at night, I wasn't really that interested in last night's news. And there was a lot of there's stories bubbling along, like obviously the Chauvin murder case for the murder of George Floyd is, it's very important in the scheme of things, but the decision is going to be really important. I sort of feel like I know what's going to happen every day. I haven't seen anything really that surprised me in the testimony. I mean, having followed it closely when it happened, I haven't really been surprised yet. The Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, or however you pronounce his name, I never have figured it out. That's a huge story. It's a major sex scandal. But right now, as somebody asked here, what evidence is there? Well, there's texts that have come out. There's certainly, sort of creepy tweets and photographs and stuff. But no, there really isn't anything yet formally on the table. So that didn't interest me very much. And I am interested in the inter-party jockeying that I'm going to talk more about between Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, and the Trump wing of the party. And that's interesting, but that's kind of in the weeds for a lot of people. And when you're writing at 11:30 at night and you're thinking, does anybody really care what happened? And I actually forgot to put it in there now that I think about it. I actually had some minutes I had a story from a House Republican conference, and I don't know, at midnight I'm thinking, do you really have to read about this stuff tonight? Not really, to my mind. But having just said all those denigrating things about modern politics and basically said, you don't need to be here, there's nothing happening. In fact, there's something enormously interesting happening right now in American politics and in American government, and it is a sea change. It is one of those. Yes, will our grandchildren learn about this moment? Absolutely. They will learn about this not only in a political science class about realignments, but also in the history books. We are living through a major realignment, and this actually not only keeps me up at night, I think about it all the time. So this goes back to the question of, is Biden serious about bipartisanship? Will he negotiate with what's included in infrastructure? And I'm going to talk more about this in a second, but is he serious about bipartisanship? Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a but coming, right? Absolutely, he is serious about bipartisanship. But Biden has done something that, quite frankly, I don't think a lot of us saw coming. I certainly didn't, and I do this for a living. And that is that he recognized and has articulated in a way that even people who saw it, and I saw it, but I didn't articulate it, did not do, was he recognized that rank and file Republicans, the people who are voting Republican, have a very different set of interests than current day Republican lawmakers. And so when he talked about bipartisanship, what he has said is, and he said, you know, in retrospect, he said it so much. I used to say to Buddy, if he says that stupid line one more time, and he would say, Heather, just because you're listening to everything that's happening, nobody else is. It's okay if he keeps repeating himself. He always said, I'm going to be the president for everybody, not just for Democrats. And he has done that. He has been the president for everybody. But, and you can see Jen Psaki saying this, and you can see Biden saying this, he says, that does not necessarily mean that I am going to compromise with Republican leadership, because they are out of step with the rest of this country. And that is such a simple concept, and it is such a game changer. So, for example, the American Rescue Plan, which passed to try and rebuild the economy after COVID. And a lot of people said, oh, you know, there's the Republican lawmakers complained that there was only a certain percentage of money in that American Rescue Plan that directly addressed COVID itself. Well, of course, the bill was not about that. The law was not about that. It was about rebuilding the economy, which had been so crushed by COVID. And that bill, when that was being discussed and when it passed through Congress, 77% of Americans wanted that bill to pass. 77% of Americans can't agree on anything. So the idea that it had that kind of support, and at the same time that there was not a single Republican in Congress who voted for it. What does that say to you? It says a number of things to me. It says to me, first of all, that in the question of is Biden trying to be bipartisan, sure, he's actually listening to Republican voters. It also says to me, and this I've alluded to a couple of times this week, that we have a real problem with the fact that our actual lawmakers and our government does not reflect the will of the American people any longer. And that's a problem, and I may or may not have time to talk about it. Yeah, I think I will have time to talk about it today. That's a problem for our democracy. It's a problem that right now speaks very badly of the Republican Party, but saying that we have this misfit is not a partisan position. You know, there is this increasing sense that the way our system is currently set up, we have lawmakers and people in control who do not reflect our majority, which might fly if this were an autocracy, but it's not, it's a democracy. So what happens to a democracy when when our coat doesn't fit us any longer? When the people in charge no longer reflect our will? That's a problem for our democracy, and it is one that we must work out, or we won't have a democracy any longer. And, you know, obviously I have ideas about how to fix that, but so do a lot of people. I don't have any magic wand, but what I'm trying to do is call out the fact it's a problem. And the fact that I'm saying it's a problem does not make me a partisan for one side or another. It's a reality that right now we have a mismatch between the American people and the people who are ruling over us. So, or ruling for us, or leading us, theoretically leading us. So is Biden serious about bipartisanship? Yes. So he is absolutely trying to do what the majority of Americans want. But now the corollary to that, or not corollary, that what somebody added on to that question is, will he negotiate what is included in infrastructure? And this goes back to that first point. Is he serious about bipartisanship? What's interesting is that the Republican lawmakers and media makers who are increasingly controlling the party, and if you saw the excerpt in Politico from John Boehner's forthcoming book, he said, you know, in 2010, the Republican Party ceased to be led by the lawmakers and became led by the Fox News channel and not Newsmax, it wasn't there yet, Breitbart, and some of the early right-wing media channels. They are pushing, they are really pushing language that doesn't reflect reality. So one of the things that's interesting is they are attacking this major infrastructure package as not being about infrastructure. And what they've done is they have really, really narrowly defined infrastructure. So they're roads and bridges. Well, That doesn't even include things like railroads, which were included in early infrastructure projects. Our first infrastructure project, big infrastructure project, people pointed out the first real infrastructure projects were on the coastline, but the first internal infrastructure project were the railroads. And that's not even, the Republicans are not even including that. So when they say it's not really about infrastructure, well, what they're doing is they're really narrowly defining infrastructure. So what about broadband? Broadband really seems like infrastructure. And interestingly enough, the Trump administration defined broadband as infrastructure and passed a bill trying to promote broadband as infrastructure. So the Republicans are now backing off of all that to try and paint the Democrats as being irresponsible with money and putting all kinds of pork in things. And yet the bill is an attempt to try and wrest us back into viability with other modern countries. So one of the things that is interesting that is currently included in the bill is, for example, support for childcare. Well, you can already hear, having me said that, the sort of howls from the right saying that's not infrastructure. Well, isn't it? I mean, in order for women to participate in the workforce, and men too, but of course it's single mothers that really I'm thinking of here, don't they have to have access to put their children somewhere safe? I mean, doesn't that count? We can certainly argue about those things, about whether or not that should be included. But simply to say it's not included is a political position that hasn't ever been argued thoroughly to its outcome. I think you can make a very good case that childcare does belong in there. And we really should go through and argue this bill responsibly, but for the Republicans simply to denigrate it and to dismiss it by saying, oh, there's really not infrastructure in that. Really, railroads? So will he negotiate with what's included in infrastructure? My guess is, if it is done in good faith, sure. And that seems to me to be a legitimate place to go. One of the things that was interesting about the American Rescue Plan was that, Biden asked for a lot in that. And by running away from it and simply saying, no, we're not going to have anything to do with it, the Republicans basically refused to negotiate to get anything they wanted. And normally when one negotiates, one starts at a much higher place than one plans to end up. And my guess is this infrastructure plan is the same. Although remember, of course, that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party wants more in that bill than is currently in it. So that's the answer for that question. Now, let me see about this. So let me jump down to this. All right. So here's a question. Why won't the Republicans play along? Why won't they vote for an infrastructure bill? It's a no-brainer. Americans love infrastructure, and the idea that infrastructure is expensive, yeah, well, maybe. Well, first of all, it puts a ton of people to work, but second of all, have you popped a tire in the middle of rush hour in a pothole and discovered that the solution to that is cheap? The idea that we're sort of offloading all of the fact that we don't have infrastructure onto individuals, just because it's coming out of my own personal pocket to pay for, my own road or whatever, doesn't make it cheaper. It just means that it's getting offloaded rather than having everybody work on it together. And by the way, in Colonial America, in fact, when you had to work on the roads, you literally had to work on the roads. You had to show up a few days a year to actually work on the roads with shovels. And people are like, well, this is stupid. Why don't we all just pitch in some money and hire somebody who knows what they're doing, which is essentially what we're doing with an infrastructure project. But so the question is, why, when things are this popular, won't McConnell and the Republicans get on board? And this, again, is one heck of a good question. And this goes back to what the current day Republican leadership is. And you will notice that I often divorce the idea of Republican leadership from the rank and file. And I'm obviously not going to go into maps and into divisions today, because I'm going to make some broad generalizations about both that I promise you we could argue about, and I'm not trying to whitewash anything here. But what happened to the Republican Party was that coming out of World War II and the Depression, when the Democrats under Franklin Delano Roosevelt pioneered a new type of American government, a government that regulated business, provided a basic social safety net, Social Security, for example, and regulated business hours and things like that, at working hours, and promoted infrastructure and things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was the federal corporation that tried to provide a whole package improvement to the Tennessee Valley, the dams that would bring electricity and the improvements in that Tennessee Valley. That in these infrastructure packages that would bring electricity, for example, to areas that corporations didn't want or companies didn't want to bring them. That with the invention, or really the establishment, because FDR was not the person who invented it necessarily, although he certainly nurtured it. With that establishment of that new kind of government, when Eisenhower takes office after being elected in 1952, he takes office in 1953, he continues that philosophy of government. He changes the name of it. He calls it the middle way. But he continues to believe that the U.S. government has a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. And it's worth remembering that the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was, until very recently, the biggest public works program in American history. And that idea of the government having that kind of a role in society infuriated a small group of reactionaries, essentially, who believed, certainly they didn't like the idea of the taxes that were required for the social safety net, but above all, they hated the idea of federal regulation of their businesses. That's what they really didn't like. And they began to flirt with libertarianism, among other things, but they began to push back against this idea that was shared by both Democrats and Republicans, that the government had this role to play in the economy and in society. And that idea of the government that has this role became known in the 1950s as the liberal consensus. And the liberal consensus was based around the idea that the government needed to intervene in the economy through regulation and through social safety and social safety net and through infrastructure in order to guarantee that the liberal, the individual, had equal access to resources and was an equal member of society. So by the 1950s, we get the implementation of the change in the term liberal from what it was in the mid-19th century and before to what Teddy Roosevelt did. And first, in the middle of the 19th century, the idea of liberal meant that you needed to keep the government small so that a big government wouldn't crush an individual. Teddy Roosevelt says, hey, wait a minute, we got a problem, because with the rise of the factories, we actually need to have a bigger government. FDR takes a look at that and says, well, yeah, let's build that bigger government. And he goes ahead and he does that. And so we have this liberal consensus government coming out of the 1950s that is embraced by Republicans and Democrats both. But these guys hate it. And in 1951, we get William F. Buckley Jr. writing this book called God and Man at Yale. And with that book in 51, he says, we got a problem here, because the whole idea of the Enlightenment was that if you put arguments in front of people, they choose well. And that can't be right, because we are trying to get them to get rid of this stupid liberal consensus, and they keep choosing it. Therefore, it proves that the idea of fact-based, reasoned argument is wrong. And that instead of going ahead and trying to make arguments to try and get people to get rid of this government that they like, we're going to have to go ahead and insist on the idea that the government must promote what he calls free enterprise, but was essentially get rid of government regulation, and religion. He's a staunch Catholic. And that those are positions that are inviolable. They're like the Ten Commandments. That's where we have to start. And from that, then we can maybe argue about the government. But those things right there are inviolable. And everybody looks at that book and they're like, you're nuts. Like, we look at this government just won World War II and got us out of the Depression. we have the highest GNP in our history. Everybody's, getting a house and 4 kids, and we're getting these gorgeous cars. And you're not going to argue with me on that. The cars are beautiful in the 1950s. And why would we want to get rid of this government? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So then, of course, we get increasingly in the 1950s, from 1950 on, the pressure against the idea that this liberal consensus is, in fact, ushering a form of socialism or communism into America. And in 1954, we not only get the Army McCarthy hearings when Joe McCarthy tries to argue that the U.S. Army has been infiltrated by communists, but we also have the Supreme Court deciding unanimously the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision, in which it says, hey, we have an issue here that state segregation of schools is unconstitutional, that the idea of separate but equal that's established in 1896 by Plessy versus Ferguson is wrong. We're overturning that, and we're going to replace it with the idea that, in fact, separate but equal is not okay. And when that happens, a couple of things happen. First of all, in 54, William F. Buckley Jr. and his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, write a different book called McCarthy and His Enemies. And what they say in that book is, yeah, McCarthy might have had a little rough edges, the whole calling everybody a communist thing and ruining careers and all that. But he was right and what he was doing was right, because he was arguing that basically this liberal consensus is ushering socialism into America. And in that book, they divide the world between capital L liberals, by whom they mean everybody who believes in the liberal consensus. So that's Eisenhower and all the Republicans all the way through the Democrats. So these L liberals who are ushering in a form of socialism or communism that they really don't distinguish at all from the idea of international communism that has in 1949 taken over China, for example, or the USSR, but it's China they're really focusing on. And standing against them, they say, are the capital C conservatives. And they say, they actually call themselves at one point radical conservatives, because what they want to do is they want to get rid of that whole New Deal government and take it back to the 1920s, when the government didn't regulate the economy and didn't regulate business and didn't provide a social safety net and didn't promote infrastructure. And they do so based on a document from 1937 called the Conservative Manifesto. But they do so with the recognition that they are not really conservatives at all, that they're radicals. They want to get rid of the government that works and go back to this old one based on the idea of free enterprise and the protection of religion. And basically, in 54, people are like, okay, you guys are crazy, right? But with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, what happens is those people who are trying to overturn this new liberal consensus government are able to say, see, we told you. We told you that the minute you got a government that got involved in the economy, tried to provide a basic social safety net and promote infrastructure, was only a question of time until they began distributing your hard-earned tax dollars to Black people. And their real example is going to be in 1957, when Eisenhower sends the troops to Little Rock Central High School to protect the Little Rock Nine when they're trying to go to high school. And people point out, hey, those are your tax dollars that are supporting those federalized National Guard troops. And in 1955, Buckley begins to publish National Review. And National Review, right after Brown versus Board of Education, begins to say, hey, and they actually bring on board a Richmond editor to say, hey, we told you that there was going to be your tax dollars being used for racial equality. And they harness racism to their theory in order to go ahead and gradually to take over the Republican Party. And that meant that wing of the party, which is so divorced from Eisenhower, who is, of course, is the person who went ahead and appointed or nominated and appointed, it's not the right word, Earl Warren, the former Republican governor of California, to the head of the Supreme Court, who got the unanimous Brown versus Board of Education decision. Eisenhower, who worked at desegregating the federal contracting and the military. You know, he is completely divorced from these people. He didn't like McCarthy. He wanted him to. He thought he was causing trouble. He worked against that wing of the party. But what happened is that wing gradually managed to leverage the racism and by 1970 the sexism that was supporting the idea that your tax dollars were going for them, whoever them might be, in order to take over the Republican Party. And what happened then was that through the 1980s, with the rise of Ronald Reagan, who, of course, with his welfare queen, really ties into this idea of white tax dollars being sucked by black, lazy, welfare recipients. What he does, and he starts his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right near where civil rights workers were killed, and he says at that speech, he says, I believe in states' rights. I mean, he's pretty clearly tying into all that. But his big thing is that a federal government is both redistributing tax dollars from hardworking white people to African Americans, but also he says that that it is destroying individual enterprise. And so part of his whole thing was to go ahead and to get rid of federal regulation of business, as you remember from the very beginning. That's one of the things he does. He begins by slashing taxes and then by slashing regulations, making it harder for workers to strike, and going ahead and beginning the process of dismantling that New Deal government that FDR and Eisenhower had set up. Eisenhower's not really New Deal, he's middle way, but so the question was, why won't McConnell work with the Democrats on any of these bills? And the answer to that is that you can't. If you truly believe that the government has no role to play in regulating business or providing a basic social safety net or promoting infrastructure, how do you compromise with nothing? I mean, if you have an absolutist position, how do you compromise with that? And one of the things that I found fascinating was when I can never tell the difference because they each have 4 letters in their name, either Rand Paul or Paul Ryan. I'm sorry, I know they're not the same man, but I see letters in pictures and there's 4, they're 2 names. One or the other of them used to talk about getting rid of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And everyone's like, oh, he doesn't really mean it. I'm like, yes, he does. And he does because that's internally consistent. And just for the record, since I care a lot about intellectual history, if somebody's got a coherent position, more power to them. I don't have to agree with it, but give me somebody who's being honest about it rather than somebody who's lying to my face every single time. Because if you know what's on the table, you can work with it. But having someone say, no, I would never touch your Social Security at the same, or the Trump administration, no, we are going to protect the Affordable Care Act when they are literally in court trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act, that makes me crazy. But saying, no, we don't believe that the government has any role to play here, and here. I mean, I disagree with that, but I certainly respect that as a position. I think it's wrong, but it's internally coherent. And what they would say, I'm not making this argument and putting it in a modern day politician's mouth, but I know about it because I read the exact same thing from politicians in the 1880s, the 1890s, and the 1900s, and in the 1850s, is that you don't want the government to get involved in regulating business or providing a basic social safety net or promoting infrastructure, because that will weaken the American people. It will enable less good people. That's not very well put. Those are bad adjectives. It will weaken the country. Basically you need to see the world as one in which the really good people should really run everything, and everybody else should be run by them. Because most of us don't really know what we're doing, and we have weaknesses. Women, people of color, whatever. We don't really know what we're doing, and therefore we should be directed by these people who have won the race of life, if you will, and who in their minds are therefore proven to be better than the rest of us. And that's really almost a paraphrase of people like James Henry Hammond or Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, there's wiggle room around the edges on that one, but it's a coherent position. I don't agree with it, I mean, I think the vast majority of us don't agree with it. But that's why McConnell can't now say, yeah, sure, I'll meet you halfway, because there isn't a halfway when you have a firm position like that. And he says even the most simple bills that help to promote a social safety net, for example, he says are communism. He says that, I'm sorry, socialism. He says those are destroying America, that the Democrats are radical socialists. Well, again, this has nothing to do with world socialism at all. That's a socialism, a system of government in which the government literally owns the means of production. And do you see that happening anywhere in America? Of course not. They get there from the idea that if the government goes ahead and regulates business, it means that a business owner cannot make as much money as he otherwise would. And that means the government is taking some of his or their money, and therefore the government, in their mind, starts to have some ownership of their company by doing that. At least that's the way the argument was laid out in the 1890s when they made this sort of an argument. So he really can't compromise. But then that brings up the next question. So who does McConnell represent then? McConnell gets elected by ordinary Americans, theoretically, but who is his real constituency? Well, his real constituency are people who benefit from there not being any business regulation and not being a basic social safety net and getting to privatize infrastructure. And that, of course, are the very wealthy businessmen in the country. And McConnell represents them very well indeed. And if you believe in a society in which those are the people who should run our country, he's doing a great job. It doesn't happen to be what I believe, but it bothers me when people don't recognize that there really is an ideological struggle going on here, and there is an ideological coherence to both sides of that argument. All right, so somebody asked me to talk about this moment, and there's a lot of good stuff here. So I think I'm actually going to jump forward and not talk about what I was going to talk about instead and talk about some of this other stuff. What I really ought to do is save all the material I don't get to in a week and then just do a week of throwing everything back together, because I really want to talk about cancel culture. I don't think I have time. So I'm going to jump forward and I'm going to go ahead. So this raises the question about, that comes from Boulder, is there any hope for gun safety laws? Of course there's hope for gun safety laws. There's hope for all these laws if we manage to make the will of the American people actually take hold in Congress again. And this is one of the reasons the Republicans are in such a terrible bind, because again, with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which every Republican voted against, and yet which 77% of Americans liked, you might have seen that almost immediately the Republicans began essentially to imply that they'd had something to do with it, even though they didn't, tweeting out, hey, look what's in this great bill, to which Democrats responded, yeah, you didn't vote for any of it. And the Republicans are very aware that they've got this pressure coming at them from their the people who want to get rid of business regulation and taxes and to privatize infrastructure. On the one hand, the people who have in the past been supplying their money, and their voters, and those two things are no longer in sync. And one of the things I read about last night was the fact that increasingly donors on the ground, individual voters, are putting money toward the Trump wing of the party, not toward the McConnells and the McCarthys, who themselves are absolutely extremists on the ideology I was just talking about. But what happens then? Because if in fact they get thrown out, or their powers weakened even further by corporate donations drying up in the wake of the voter suppression bills, then all the power in the party runs to the Matt Gaetzes or Gatzes or whatever it is, and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Jim Jordans and people like that, and they do not have a broad base. I mean, basically that looks like it's either going to be the suicide of the Republican Party, or it's going to be the end of American democracy. And that's this place I wanted to end up, where somebody asked, if indeed the Republicans pass their voter suppression laws, is there any possible way for Democrats to be elected anymore? So I want to start by saying, first of all, you have to remember the difference between state elections and federal elections. And that's important here because will Democrats ever be elected again? Sure, in Massachusetts, probably California. States that are heavily Democratic and the state legislatures are Democratic now, probably. But I will point out to you that this has happened before in American history, and it was called the Solid South. And in the South, between 1877 and 1964, there were elections. Every single election season, there were elections in the South. And the Democrats won them. The Democrats were in control of the American South for at least 2 generations, because 3 generations, because maybe even 4 generations. Usually a generation in history is 25 years, 20 to 25 years. Because they suppress the vote of their opponents. And this is one of the points that Stacey Abrams, who runs Fair Vote in Georgia, talks about. She says, stop calling these red states. They're voter suppression states. Because if you, in fact, make it sure that people can vote, places like Georgia go blue, which is what we just discovered. And that's even in a time when there was a lot of voter suppression in that state in this last 2020 election. So if, in fact, these voter suppression laws go into place, will Democrats ever win those states again? No. At least history says they won't. Certainly they didn't after the voter suppression laws went into place in the South in the 1890s, after the Mississippi Constitution of 1890. And so we've done this before. And why do you care about this? Well, you might care about it because you're a Democrat and you would kind of like to win at the national level again. But you also should care about it if you're a Republican, because one-party states, first of all, are not democracies. And you might not care about that either. You might say, I don't care. I'm perfectly happy with, the Trump wing of the party running everything in the country because that's what I care about. But actually, you're wrong about that too, for the simple reason that in a government, if you have a party running things that does not have oversight, it means 2 things. First of all, it means extraordinary fiscal corruption because nobody's watching the cookie jar and complaining about what's happening to the cookie jar, first of all. And second of all, it matters because once one party is in control of everything, you no longer have any hope of their people being equal before the law. And again, you might say you don't care about that, whatever, so long as my people are in control. Well, that means, though, that it doesn't really matter if you follow the law or not. It matters who your friends are and how quickly, and that you have to stay friends with those people or they could turn on you. And all of a sudden, maybe your son and his friends are out drinking and driving, and the other kids are all friends with the sheriff, and you and the sheriff had a fight. The other 3 kids walk, and your kid gets thrown in jail. And this is the essence, really, of what is at stake in America right now, not only in terms of the situation I just made up, but in terms of what it means to be an American. Do we have equality before the law? And I think, personally, that if you look at the way the law has been meted out, not only to people at the bottom of our society, either because of their wealth or gender or race or status or, did I say gender? Whatever. But also at the top, people who have, at least to my neophyte eyes, committed crimes and skated for it because of who they were. You have a real problem, because once the equal justice before the law breaks down, it's not a question of what you've done, it's a question of who you know. And once it's a question of who you know, it's just a question of power. And that is, and I'm not original in thinking of that. Obviously, there's many people who thought about it, but the person who talked about it and the person I'm channeling when I speak about it that way is Abraham Lincoln. And he said, once you start making categories and saying, okay, and he's concerned about African Americans for sure, but he's also concerned with Chinese immigrants to the West Coast. And he says, once you start saying that they're going to be taxed differently than everybody else, as California did in 1850, or that they can't testify in court, as California said in, I think it was 52 or 54, once you start to say that the Irish in Massachusetts don't have rights either, then you're starting to build categories and saying some people are better than others. And once you've done that, then it's really just a question of making sure that you're one of the people on the ins, because once you're one of the people on the outs, people can do anything to you. And that's when you start to think about autocracies and what happens if, for example, you live in Russia and you don't get along with Putin's people. It's not a healthy position to be in. And you can even see the Russian President Vladimir Putin joking about it. I hope you're very healthy. Well, that's because people who run against him tend to die. They tend to jump out of windows quite frequently, or have a problem with poison. And so that's one of the reasons that people like me are fighting so hard these voter suppression laws. And again, they are voter suppression laws, and you see again, the Republicans recognize that there's no excuse for them. So they're trying to say, oh, they expand voting. No, they don't. That's just stupid. They don't. That's a lie. And it's really quite deliberate. So, for example, in the Georgia law, one of the things it does, and you can literally see the words crossed out, is they get rid of somebody like Brad Raffensperger, who is a staunch Republican, but who refused to do as Donald Trump asked and count in an extra 11,000 and change votes to go ahead and give Trump the election. Well, they got rid of Raffensperger's power to do that and have replaced him with a partisan group, a partisan Republican group. So, would they have found those 11,000 votes? Yeah, of course. And that's exactly the sort of thing that a country that doesn't believe in the rule of law does. So a couple other questions about that. People asked about the term Jim Crow legislation, and I wanted to actually address that because it's kind of interesting. The phrase Jim Crow actually comes from the pre-war years, and it comes from a man named Thomas Dartmouth Rice, also known as Daddy Rice. And Daddy Rice is known as the father of minstrelsy because he was a famous minstrel performer. And the minstrel shows were shows of white men performing in blackface. That is, they would literally burn the end of a cork, and it would turns black, and it would and they would use it to blacken their faces, and they would then do skits that were sort of set pieces that would entertain an audience, rather as if the variety shows from the 1960s, if you remember it. And I am not making the racial connection here at all, but I'm just trying to remind you of like now we have sitcoms where there's a through line, but if you remember Carol Burnett, still the funniest show on television, or Laugh-In, they'd have a set piece, one piece, and then another piece, and then another piece. Well, that was the setup of a minstrel show. Again, I'm not making a racial connection there, but this idea of there being pictures, but in these set pieces, Rice and the other performers, although he was the most famous performer, would do skits in which they pretended to be Black Americans, in which they sang songs and did stupid skits and pretended to be stupid, and they were, one of his most famous songs was Jump Jim Crow. And so the idea of Jim Crow as a Black performer or a Black person gets established in between the 1830s and the 1840s, and that's where we get the idea of Jim Crow. But just so you know, one of the places Jim Crow shows up again, which always fascinates me, is in Dumbo. If you think about Walt Disney's Dumbo, the crows on the branch there are literally, the leader of them is known as Jim Crow. And because it was such a common idea there. But what's interesting about that is those are really deeply problematic characters in a number of ways. Yes, they are Jim Crow characters, and yet they're the only people in the movie who sympathize with Dumbo, the elephant, and they're wise. And they're actually played by Black actors in that film. So not the leader of them. He's a white guy, but the rest of them are Black guys. And it's a really kind of an interesting set piece reflecting on the meaning of identity in that period. I think it was filmed in the 40s in America, the meaning of Black identity, and perhaps the changing meaning of Black identity and the ways in which, but the way that white people saw Black identity, and the ways in which that was sort of malleable in that period around the time of World War II. There's a lot more that I wanted to talk to you about. The KKK people asked about, and certainly about the New Deal. Let me just end very quickly here. And gerrymandering, and anyway, there's a lot more that I was going to tell you about, and I didn't. So somebody asked about the New Deal, and is what Biden is doing looking like the New Deal? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. That since Reagan, we have been mired in a period in which the argument was that the way that the government could most effectively help our economy grow was to cut taxes. And that idea is really quite an old one in American history. It really comes from the 1920s and before, but from the period before the New Deal government. And it was really outdated by the idea of John Maynard Keynes, who was an economist who, first of all, when FDR starts to play around with the idea of pumping money into the economy, he's not necessarily reacting to Keynes. It's entirely likely he's reacting simply to the exigencies of the situation. When there's a war, you have to fight it. And that's always what has happened in America. And since the Civil War, it had always worked to really help the American economy. And so FDR is pulling on that to some degree. But what we got out of the mid-century, the mid-20th century, is the recognition that the government really can use fiscal policy and economic investment to go ahead and to invest in the economy and to build it. And that idea, as I say, fell into disrepute because of that theory that I talked about with coming to the fore during Ronald Reagan's time and after that. And this is a major pushback against that, to try and reinvest in the American economy, reinvest in ordinary Americans, and to prime the pump of the economy. And of course, it's working. We're getting jobs coming back, and things certainly seem to be as if they're headed in a really good direction. I want to leave you with one interesting thought, though. There's a new book out, by the way, on the connection between this moment and the New Deal by Eric Rauchway, who's Mr. New Deal. It's Rauchway's great. He's a personal friend. I should disclose that, but he's a great historian. One of the ways in which this moment is different is that the New Deal really focused on a heteronormative nuclear family. What FDR is trying to do, and certainly Eisenhower after him, is to preserve essentially the power of white men, although they certainly include people of color as well, white men to protect their families. What's fascinating to me about this moment with Biden is what he and his people seem to be trying to protect are children, regardless of who parents those children. And that is a game changer, it seems to me. And I don't know what that's going to look like, and I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's not more of the same. It's a really innovative, really interesting moment that, to my mind, whose time has come. Among other things, one of the things that's fascinated me over the many last years is the focus on trying to recover lost jobs in factories. Well, they're not coming back because of automation. That has nothing to do with how we're investing or anything. People's jobs are getting replaced by machines. But we have already the superstructure to create great paying jobs that are in every community in the country. And that's healthcare aides, both for the elderly and for children. And that's one of the things that's in that infrastructure bill and was in the American Rescue Plan. And so just even seeing that go into place, to me, is a game changer. So we'll see where this all ends up. All right, sorry I didn't get to all your questions, but I got sidetracked on some of the minutia, and that's what I love. Thank you for being here. I will see you if you come on Thursday. Otherwise, I'll be back next Tuesday to do this all again. Thanks for being here.